it's good to have this supreme spokesman for the gospel ideas, and it's good to have a focal point of unity, someone who holds it together, someone who can call the council to begin with. That's part of our contribution. Just like back on the sacramental thing, I forgot to say this, but in a world that's sort of flat and one-dimensional, where there's not enough, no good sense of ritual and symbol and so on, Catholics are in a position to contribute that to the society as a whole. It's back to my original premise here, that it's not a defensive posture on all of this, but really something that we have to contribute, even on the Marian doctrines. You know, the role of women. And we could build a good theology of the feminine equality in this, based on that kind of notion. The prime role of Mary in the history of salvation. So I think we do have something to say on all that. The Protestant world does not have someone similar. They feel the pinch on that. It's looking for this. This is why one way union will come about. In the sense we could need a spokesman. Let me say something about the moral questions now. Or on the life of the church. Better add this. While we are big on the institution, what we are finding reforms in the Catholic Church now that have more democratic procedures. So we have, you notice the Pope said he's going to make something out of the Synod of Bishops. So the bishops come together with him and meet. In the diocese, Father Blazer and I are what we call the priest senate. We get together and talk with the bishop about what goes on in the diocese. There are diocesan pastoral council where the lay people meet with the bishop to talk about how the diocese can be run. Most parishes have parish councils now. So what we're doing is introducing more and more democratic procedures into the church so we can overcome this heavy institutionalism and get the ideas flowing from the grassroots. So the Protestant world's been good at that. Protestants have very often had more democratic procedures. But they've had the problem then of getting control. A lot of ministers, they feel they're afraid to, they think we priests got it made because we can get up in the pulpit and preach whatever we want. I mean, no one's going to fire us tomorrow if they don't like the sermon. But in some of our friends in the Protestant ministry feel the pressure that way. After all, they were hired in a sense. You know, the pulpit committee brought them in. And if they get too out of tune with the congregation, they just might not be around there anymore. That depends on which denomination. But very often they envy the freedom that we have. So while they've had more democratic procedures, and we need to learn from that, it appears as though they need to learn something from us in terms of having some sort of institutional controls and freedom within those structures. On the moral questions, the birth control thing, have we rehearsed that? Have we gone over that? Have I talked about it? You skip it? The Catholic position, what we've got is a majority opinion and a minority opinion in the Catholic community. The majority position is in favor of a liberalization on the birth control question, of that contraceptives in certain situations are all right, that the couple has to make a decision based on economic situation, the health of the mother, the education of children, etc. That I would call the majority position in the Catholic community today. There is also a minority position, which happens to be headed by the Pope, and which gives that minority a greater weight, and is summarized in the statement Humanae Vitae, which says that every act of intercourse must be open to procreation, and that the use of contraceptives is wrong. So in the Catholic community, we have a split on that. Even the original commission that decided it voted 56-4. That made the recommendation voted 56-4 to Pope Paul VI to say that there ought to be a liberalization. He went with the 4, with the minority group. The problem is, of course, is that theologians keep saying that he doesn't give good reasons for his position. There's no scriptural basis for it. The one former argument used about Onan spilling his seed in the Old Testament is now recognized not to refer to birth control at all. And so much of the scriptural basis is lost. So what we have in the Catholic community now is a split. And I would say, what would you have? Something like maybe 75% of the priests, for example, in the United States are in favor of a more open position, liberal position on birth control. That means what? That if you go to confession, you got 3 out of 4 chance of hitting right one. So, and I'd say you have about the same percentage of lay people probably who feel the same way. So that's it's a very instructive example of the way the Catholic community is not monolithic and is split, and the way the leadership has lost some control over the group as a whole. On abortion, I guess the Catholic community is known to be in the forefront of the fight for the rights of the unborn. I think that that's a good thing. I think that somebody has to speak up for the rights of any minority group, any group that can't defend itself, and I think the Catholic community needs to do that, but we need to build coalitions on that, because a lot of our Protestant friends agree with us. So the Catholic issue, it should not be a Catholic issue, it ought to be a Christian issue of respecting rights of the unborn. And I don't really think too many Christians want to say that the way to solve our problems is to just make abortion easy. And we need, what the Catholics have not found is ways to enlist the support of other people and to build a moral consensus on the point. Once we're beyond that, we got a lot of splits. Some people want to work for a change of an amendment, a constitutional amendment. I figure that that's a waste of effort by and large. If we can't get ERA through, how the hell are we ever going to get an amendment through on the abortion thing? I mean, it's just, getting amendments through these days is not easy. And anyway, they got a lot of Catholics working very hard on this amendment business to the Constitution to protect the rights of the unborn. I think we have to find another way to sell this question. That's personal opinion on that. Oh, I feel that I have not managed the time properly since I'm on Roman numeral 2. And this is what interests me. This is what I'm into, you know. This American experience. What is it about this? Living in America makes you a different kind of Catholic than if you lived in Italy or Spain. We rub shoulders with Protestants. We have a more open attitude. We've had to live with pluralism. Most of us know Protestants, and we know that those old fights don't mean anything. Most of us don't know what those fights are. We don't care. Most of the people, the young people I talk to, are more in favor of intercommunion. Almost all of them that I talk to say, well, yeah, we ought to liberalize on that. Let's not be so strict. We have different set of perceptions because we grew up in a free situation, because we've interacted with people of other faiths, because we've worked on common projects and so on. One thing we have to remember is that we are the offspring of the immigrant generation. What is that? I quote a stat in there. So 40% of us are first or second generation immigrants. And you know, the American experience in the United States was not an easy one. We came over here, we had to adapt to a waspish culture, to the Anglo-Saxon world. It was a Protestant, dominated by a Protestant culture. Catholics were put down in those days in the 19th century, much as blacks are today. You read some of the stuff they said about the Catholics living in the city. They were drunk all the time. Their family life was messed up. They were a drag. They need not apply for certain jobs, etc. Got to remember that. We're not back. We're just back 2 generations for this. And many people are saying today that a lot of this anti-Catholicism is still at work in the United States. We haven't gotten rid of it, and that's why we can't get any place on tax credits for our schools, and why we can't get support on abortion and so on. Now, I don't know exactly what to make of all of that, but a lot of people are talking about the nativist prejudice. Nativism meaning the Anglo-Saxon world not liking the Catholics who are here. And then there is that stereotype of the Catholic ethnic. I suppose that is epitomized by the Polish jokes, in which the Catholic ethnic is not too bright, he's racially prejudiced, he's hasn't made it economically, he's politically conservative, all of those kinds of things. Now, Greeley has done some important research, and he claims that that whole stereotype is wrong, The Catholics have made it economically now. We now have a percentage of college graduates that's beyond our percentage in the population. We're about 1/4 of the population. We got about 1/3 of the college graduates under a certain age. So we have made it that way. Catholics have made it educationally, or economically. I mean, we are now moved up right, under. I don't know. There's a couple of ethnic groups that are still ahead of us. That we've gone up that way. He shows a lot of evidence to show that Catholics were more opposed to the Vietnamese War as a group sooner than other groups, and so on. So we find what Greeley is trying to do is attack the stereotype of the Catholic in our culture. And he claims that there's still one way we haven't arrived, and that is that we are kept out of the elite positions in the centers of learning and in the highest levels of certain corporations. And he feels that is part of the prejudice that surrounds us. And then he tries to tell us ways in which maybe we are different, that Catholics are maybe more neighborhood-oriented, more closer ties to family. That's hard. I think, like when a Protestant marries a Catholic, that's something that's very often hard to deal with. The Catholic seems to have some closer ties to the family that the Protestant partner can't really understand all that well. Well, I obviously don't have time to go through all that. I better move into my 1-minute wind-up here. Will you bear with me while I summarize and tell you to read through that and take my course in the spring quarter, and we'll take up all of those things. Let me conclude then with some things that, if you would bear with me for a moment. That we've talked about so many theological issues, and we can't cover them all. And I have no illusion in the beginning that we could. What I'm interested in is an orientation. Even the few minutes on American Catholicism could do that for you. It could alert you to a couple of directions and trends, ways to look in your own experience, see if those things are true and how one might be distinctive. The other areas we've given a direction, and it seems to me that one could continue to study those things. I get back to, once one has done all the theology, and all the background work that went into this course, you have to still get in tune with the central facts. Christianity turns out to be a simple thing. Christianity says one simple thing, that the mystery that surrounds us is gracious and is spoken to us in Jesus. You get through all the theology, it gets back to the fact that Christianity is the answer, the response to the question that we are. Man is the question. I have infinite longings. I want to know if life has meaning or not, if I'm worthwhile, if I'm okay. I want to know those things, and Christianity gives us a positive answer to it. It says, yes, you are okay. Yes, your life has meaning, and it is meaning because the gracious mystery has raised the man Jesus to life. You can trust life. You can trust the process. It tells me I can trust the process, even though I didn't get through everything. I can let go. I can trust people to continue to go on. So theology has to interact properly with faith. Theology has to fructify faith. The faith is simple. All the study, all the words and everything simply have the purpose of reinforcing the notion that the mystery that surrounds us is gracious, which is kind, which is the shortest kind of creed I can think of right now. Now, what I always tell the class is that if at the end of this you walk out and say, well, that's it, I've had the course, I'll never have to take another one of those things, I'll walk around the next 42 years of my life with that knowledge that I got in that contemporary theology class back there in 78, well then I failed. If that's the result, then I failed in what I'm trying to do. What my happy outcome in my mind is if people realize this. A little bit of knowledge opens up a lot more questions and the need for more study. I would think the course is successful if X number of people in this class within the next 5 years take another class someplace, sometime, or read a book, or subscribe to a journal, or continue to learn, or just have interesting discussions with people. Then what we did in here is successful because it opens out. There's no closure here, no final answers. I don't want to pretend there are. You've heard one brand of theology. You've heard one notion of contemporary theology. There are many of them available. For some, this may click. For others, not. And you should be continuing in the search. My hope is, I guess, that a certain number of people can buy into this and say, wow, that's neat, or that makes sense to me, or it's integrated. See, I believe the whole package hangs together. And for me, the approach I've used in here does, and I hope you people are able to find that for yourselves someday. So it's been especially good. We've had a good attendance, whole room, even this last night. Well over 40 people here, I think. Attendance is kept up. Good food throughout. Responsive. We've had some of the fine questions in here. Excellent questions. I tell Father Blazer, a few nights I was just really sort of thrilled personally with, I could see faces lighting up and ideas going and people learning something. And so I have tremendously positive feelings about this whole group, and I want to thank all of you for that. And I better stop. If anyone wants to stay and discuss afterwards, you're welcome to do that. I was going to, if somebody wanted to do me there's two things I have here. Up here, there are some things on the Sacrament of Penance, Catholic updates, how to go to confession. You can have these. And if anybody feels so inclined, I have some papers here. If you want to write me a short personal response to the course, like, well, this part is good, you ought to do it next time, or here's a way to improve this, or what I got out of it is this, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to leave these here. If anyone wants to take a couple minutes to do that for me, I would appreciate it. At the top of page 28, number 3, a new concept that is very much talked about among moral theologians, and that is the notion of social sin. That sin has an effect of spreading into institutions and systems. So in the past, our morality was so private, our legalism, it didn't consider the way that power of structures to mess up our minds and to co-opt us. For example, this girl, I might have to tell this girl, you're living in a society that doesn't think clearly on sexuality. You're living in a world where people think that if you don't have sexual experience, there's something wrong with you. You're living in a whole culture that's dominated by Playboy magazine. I might have to tell her that. Look, there are cultural things that distort the vision of a whole society. You can look at the materialism in the United States and say, advertising, we are bombarded by advertising day and night, which is based on one principle, that you don't have enough, that you're going to run out of it. You're going to run out of Schlitz, sure as shooting. And there's never enough right guard to go around. That's it. And therefore, because there's never enough, you're going to buy more. And so that gets into our psyches, and one begins to believe it in many ways. I need more of this. That's a materialistic ethic, and it's a social sin. You see, it's built into the fabric of our society. So sin becomes embedded in advertising, in media, in universities, in churches. Churches become sinful too. Churches work on ideology. Sin gets embedded in the attitude towards Jews in the Christian churches. Jews become bad people. The only thing you do with a Jew is try to convert them. No, that's a sin in my mind. That is a distortion of the gospel. That's what I mean by social sin. And of course, the obvious things are in a war society where money is given for armaments and not given for human needs and so on. So the concept of social sin is very important today, and most people don't think of it that way. The first time it dawned on me is when Eugene McCarthy came here and gave a talk many years ago, and said, when you watch the ads on television, you figure that Exxon is in the business of preserving wildlife. That's just, I'll never forget that. You have birds, they build a thing, and the fishing is better down there, and that's baloney. They're in the business of preserve wildlife, sure. One has to see through that. We need courses and people to learn how to watch ads, I think, and just find the advertising lies, and we have to figure out how it lies and how it distorts our perceptions. Some people at that point take a prophetic stance. Some Christians say, the great refusal, as Marcuse calls it. I say no to the whole bloody mess. I'm not buying in. We need the prophets. We need them. Not everyone can be a prophet, however. To be a prophet, you have to put your body on the line. Remember an anti-war thing, they said they were talking about building a bomb crater, or digging a hole in a bomb crater, and I was asked to give the talk to a large group assembled, and my whole bit was building a bomb crater is nice. It's a symbolic action. Symbolic action has meaning only if you put your body on the line for it. And willing to take the consequences. That's what the greatness of Martin Luther King. He disobeyed the law and civil disobedience. Gandhi, same way, civil disobedience. But they were willing to take the consequences of it. And therefore their disobedience had meaning. Go out and build a bomb crater and run away. No one finds you. I mean, who cares? You know, what did it mean? It meant something if you're willing to go to jail for building it. So prophets, and we can't all be prophets. Most of us don't have enough guts to be prophets. And most of us don't have the flair for being prophets and so on. But we would hope there's a prophetic element built into Christian morality. Then the point that we were on last Sunday around here, no love of God without love of neighbor, that translates into a need board. Need board in the parish where you write down your needs. You got to have love of neighbor. That's where it's all real. Great commandment. See, that's the uniqueness of the teaching of Jesus. He said you can't have one without the other. They've got to be together. Love of neighbor is real. Love of God is real only when translated into love of neighbor. And now, an attempt to say what the Christian contribution is here. And this goes back again to the point you made there, and that is that Christians have no blueprint. We don't have any clear answer to the world's great problems, which I've tried to list there, some of them. Overpopulation, arms race, and so on, pollution. There is no way to open up one's Bible and find out what to do about building of a nuclear reactor someplace. There's no clear statement on what to do about atomic warfare. It wasn't the question of the time. And even when Jesus did address those questions, he didn't seem to say too much. He said, render under Caesar the things that are Caesar's, the God things are God's, which didn't seem to say a whole lot about the question. So we have no blueprint. But it seems to me Christians have something to say in the world's forum, and now I've tried to list these down, and there are 9 of them there that in that paragraph. What Christians could do. Remind others that the struggle for liberation has meaning. So that to try to help the black people in this country, the Hispanics, has meaning, even if it doesn't seem to have many concrete results. It's good in itself. The cross is a part of life, the harshness of life. One can't escape it. One shouldn't try to build a utopia. It's impossible. Can't avoid the cross. That God wills good for man. What I'm trying to say there is to have a picture of God, not as the old grew up saying there, saying, I wonder how much trouble they can take. I'll give them another infliction, lay something heavier on them, but rather a picture of God that says he's fighting evil. God is trying to create a better situation. Not allowing it. I don't like that phrase, God allows evil. I say God is fighting evil, he's trying to get rid of evil, and the only block to it is us. We stop it. It's an important theology there that I think is helpful, that we should tell people. People possess an essential dignity, independent of their success. That'd be a neat thing for people here in the United States, where we think people's dignity depends on how much money they make, or what degrees they've got, or something. Voluntary renunciation of power can be liberating. That's one of Hans Kuhn's big things. That's what he wants the Pope to do, you know. Voluntary renounces power. Say, I'm not going to run this whole show. I am this, you know, the Polish cardinal comes on and says, no, I don't have to control everything. We'll join up with the Anglicans and we'll give them a lot of autonomy to run their own church. That's his solution. And he claims that whenever we give up power, that somehow that's liberating to ourselves and to others. That's a strange doctrine. That's very distinctively Christian. Don't lord it over the others, Jesus said. Don't be like the other leaders. If you're a leader, you should be a servant. Heavy thing. Now let me finish up here. Voluntary violence breeds more violence, war thing and so on. Freedom from consumerism and consumption is healthy. Someone's got to speak about poverty in today's world and so on. Dominating and exploiting people is wrong. And the example of Jesus. So what I'm saying, we could point to that and say, hey, some of these things can be done. Jesus did them. He showed us how to do them. He gives us the power to do them. So the picture is this. With all these complex problems, race, war, pollution, and so on, Christians should not sit around and say we've got the answer, but we shouldn't sit there and be quiet. We have something to say. And these are the kinds of things that people need to hear in our world. Be deep in the question. They don't want to hear them sometimes, but it needs to be said. Okay. Kenny, you had a question there.
Well, just on the specific, do you really think, the one thing that I agree, I think that it's liberating to renounce power, but the specific example of the Pope, could he do that? Would the church let him do that? Does he have that power? Would the, for example, the curia, the bureaucracy, would the bureaucracy stand for that? Wouldn't it cause, instead of really joining the Catholics with the Anglicans and stuff, wouldn't it just split the Catholics?
Very possible. Yeah, it's a delicate thing. The popes always allude to that. They're often called the prisoner of the curia. I think he said that already. He was walking around seeing people and said, well, I got to check if this is all right, with the boys, the bureaucrats who run everything. He's made comments like that, which makes me think that he's very alert to that and just might make some moves along that line. Now, throughout history, how many examples can you give of people voluntarily renouncing power? Not often. Not often. And that is a strange Christian thing. What is funny? Nixon. That was really voluntary. Yeah, right. Richard Nixon has said, really voluntary. Doesn't happen. Very rare. But that would be the Christian thing, you see, and that would be an example. I mean, I think it happens. I think people have done it. I knew a bishop like that one time who didn't, I really believe this. Bishop Leibel, let's say his name, Cincinnati, when I was teaching down there. If they went up to Bishop Leibel someday and said, hey, you're not the bishop anymore, you're the associate pastor of that little parish out there, he would have said, oh, fine, good, when do I report? He really was not hung up on his power. That's one of the few men I've ever met in my life who had power, who had that attitude. And that's, again, learning from the virtuous man. I saw it. I believed it. Now, most people, you tell me that, I wouldn't believe it. I saw it, I believe it, and I think he would have done it. And he lived that way. He didn't throw his weight around, even though he was the Archbishop of Cincinnati. And so I think it can happen. And because I saw some one man do it. I haven't seen it a lot. Most times, the more power people get, the more they want. And that's the law and the way it seems to go. Power corrupts, of course, as they say. Now, I want to take a detailed analysis of all these particular problems. But however, you're going to have to do that yourself. But it's easy now because we have the tools to do it. One can begin to look at all those problems and begin to say what Christian response can be brought to bear on them. Perhaps we can, in the distinctive Catholic things on abortion and birth control and so on, we could say something in the next class. Father Wurzel's given us some things to read there, some books that would help to guide us. I think he often recommends for one book to read, one by Locamp, The Commandments and the New Morality. I've often heard him say that if you're going to read one, read that one. It's not very thick, and it's, I think, relatively intelligible. So what are we going to say, to sum up? That there is a Christian morality. And its really distinctive feature is that it understands life as a call from God and that the main example of how to respond to that call is in Jesus of Nazareth, and especially in the law of love that he taught, and that the following of that is an extremely distinctive thing and depends on doing it intelligently. And so that one's reason comes in, but one's emotions play a role as well, and one's intuition. I guess that would be the kind of summary. Well, that's our short course in morality. I think it's a poor man's version. Next week we'll talk about the distinctive Catholic thing and the distinctive thing in the United States. I say I'm sort of excited about that and hope to see you here next week. Well, I would like to begin by saying just a few words about the last class. I usually try to catch us up a little bit on what we've been trying to do. And so in the beginning, I try to start with the broadest kinds of religious concerns and try to show that we are creatures who really have a depth dimension to all of our experience, and that in the modern world, that's often blocked for us. We're often out of touch with those deeper, mysterious realms that we call the realm of the Spirit. And that part of what needs to happen for us in the modern world is to become more aware, more attuned, or on alert, as I like to say, to the signals of transcendence, to the clues that there is a mysterious power at work in our world. So part of the task of being a religious person is to get the antennae directed properly. To have our scanning mechanisms at work so that as we look at our relationships, look at nature around us, look within our own heart, look at the vastness of the cosmos, look at the problems of freedom and love and death, look at human sexuality, that we're going to find there then these intimations of mystery, these signals that something more is going on. And then after that, it's important to be able to try to name that mystery, to be able to decide in our minds if whatever is around us that we don't control is benign or whether it is against us. Is it on our side? Can we trust it? And can we indeed enter into personal relationship with that larger mystery that surrounds us? And what I like to say is the people who think that, affirm that, we call theists or believers in God, even though it might not be terribly explicit. It's one of the ways I like to dialogue with secularized people or people with an atheistic interpretation of life, is to try to get in touch with that mystery dimension and then to see whether we can affirm that. And I remember doing a dialogue with a Marxist like that. And surprisingly, we could come very close together as we tried to describe our inner experiences, our deeper experiences of relationships and life. And we came, I think, on that occasion at least, very close to calling that transcendence or the beyond or a mysterious power. The theist is the one, I think, who eventually affirms that there is such a gracious power and that it can be addressed, that we enter into personal relationship with that power. And then we try to talk about the mystery remaining not remote, but coming close to us, drawing near in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And we tried to deal with the fact that the key event for Jesus we call the Paschal Mystery, that is, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the resurrection really is the key to it all. Might try to specify that a little more by taking a position that Rudolf Bultmann, great biblical scholar of the 20th century, some people know his work, all about demythologizing the scriptures. Well, Bultmann said this, that Jesus Christ rose in the consciousness of the disciples, which is a statement, I think, that I would not want to affirm. You see, that makes it sound as though the resurrection is just a subjective experience in the apostles' mind, almost that they manufactured it or made it up. And contrary to Bultmann, and aligning myself with a lot of contemporary scholarship, and especially my own mentor, Karl Rahner, I would say that rather there is an event that occurs to Jesus of Nazareth
that is the cause of the subjective experience of the apostles. That in fact God has raised Jesus to life, and that's what causes the change or the conversion within the apostles. So that it is not merely a subjective experience, but it is a reaction to God's working in the world. God's really touching the life of Jesus and filling up his emptiness, bringing him into the risen life. We name that the resurrection. Now, the actual dynamics of that we don't know. I mean, there's not an eyewitness. It's not an historical event like the death was. Death of Jesus is historical in the sense that people could see it and write it down and so on. The resurrection is not like that, as shown by the fact that people don't recognize Jesus in the appearance stories. It's not like his body was resuscitated or he walked down the street and people recognized him again. It is a very different situation, something that we don't understand. But the best human correlate that I have for that, in which I talked to some people after class last week and seemed to help them with this whole question, was our own evolutionary history as a human race. That when we moved from animal life to human life, there was this process in which animal life broke through into reflective life, into a new and richer kind of life where communication was possible, where love was possible, where people were free to take charge of their destiny. That was one of the great moments in the whole of the evolutionary process, that breakthrough. And that animal life that broke through didn't leave anything of the animal life behind. It took that into the new world with them. But it was all different. In one sense, it's the same anatomical structure and so on, but suddenly it's all different now, because now there is love and freedom and communication, interdependence. Well, I think that would be a correlate for what we think about Jesus of Nazareth, that his resurrection is a breakthrough, the barrier of death, into a new and richer and glorified life. That he moves into that life as the firstborn of all those who are to be saved. He goes ahead of us, breaking that barrier and enjoying the fullness of God's presence. And I think that, again, you see, he doesn't leave anything behind him. He doesn't cease to be a man, but he takes all of that forward into the new, richer life, and therefore becomes, as Paul says, life-giving spirit for us. It's though he is now charged with grace, and he can share that with us. That's why we say he continues to be operative in our world. Now, perhaps I know a lot of people had trouble with my presentation of the resurrection last week, and maybe that will help to clarify it. At least that's the best that I can do right now in trying to give us some sense of what it might be about, this breakthrough from animal life to human life. In fact, I think that's a great way to think of our own deaths, in which we don't leave anything behind, in which it's not just a soul being saved, not just a separation of soul and body, but a total person act in which we are called upon to hand ourselves over, to empty ourselves, and in so doing we break through the barrier of death and move into this richer and better life, sharing, of course, in the resurrected and glorified life of Jesus Christ. So that becomes the key. Now, the next step in this whole process, and the subject matter of this, the fourth class in this whole series, is the church. And the church has to do with the community of followers of Jesus of Nazareth, with the group of people who say they affirm the resurrection, that they think that Jesus is the key to human existence. And so this gathering of people, which we name the church, then sort of progresses throughout history and continues into our own time. And many of us sitting here say, I'm a member of that church. We became members by being baptized, and we find ourselves nourished by the sacred scriptures. And some of us gather together to celebrate the Lord's Supper and to remember the teachings of Jesus. And as a community, we try to follow out the law of love that he taught us. So when we talk about the church, I think we have some sense of this reality that we're trying to describe. But as soon as you start to talk like that, there really is a feeling about today, and there always has been throughout history, that says, well, why have the church? Who needs it? Why not just follow Jesus? Why not just read your scriptures? And I think, first of all, that really has to be addressed, because there are a lot of people in the fundamentalist world, a lot of people who roughly would call themselves evangelicals or put themselves under that umbrella, or who would say that really isn't necessary. So we, I think, first have to try to justify this. Now, I would say not that is a terribly bad position, but I would characterize it as inadequate to our human experience. And the first reason is because we are social creatures. We are people who are interdependent. We come to know our identity by interacting with other people. We need supportive community to help us in the difficult times. We need others around who challenge us to grow and develop. So it is, first of all, because we are social creatures that we need to have a social dimension to this Christian faith. We need to gather with others who will support and challenge us as we try to live it out. The other reason, I think, is that religion touches the whole person. It touches our social existence as well as our private, personal existence. We have a lot of feeling today in the culture that is what I call privatistic. That is, people wanting to just do their own thing and have their own way and live their own lives. And sort of the sense when I've really become mature is when I don't need anybody anymore. I'm my own boss, and I'm my own source of contentment and fulfillment in life. And I think that really, again, truncates the human. It reduces what we are all about. Because, again, we are whole persons. We are integrated individuals who need the other people around us. Another reason that I suggest here in the notes for this is because we're understanding more and more today that the human race is sort of a whole, an integrated whole. You know, that's one of the advances that have been made in the modern world. I mean, we've had nationalism. Boy, you know, we're going to just, the nation state, the glorification of that. We've had, ethnic kinds of considerations. What we're finding out today, following Marshall McLuhan's image, that we live in the global village. This is spaceship Earth, and we're all sort of involved in the same fate here. We are interdependent as a whole people. And when we begin to think like that, as I think the advanced thinkers have done, like people like Teilhard de Chardin or people in the whole area, the environmental area, people who have a great sense of our oneness and we're going to make it or break it together. I think when we begin to think like that, we see the shallowness, the superficiality of thinking that one is going to live one's life walking in the woods by oneself or strumming one's guitar in one's room or reading one's Bible alone. It just isn't that simple. I have this conviction that really we are totally interdependent, that no human being does anything in this world or ever has that doesn't somehow influence the whole. We are I think the advanced thinkers feel this or see this as they write about it, that indeed we are part of a whole human race here. And again, that makes religion that is privatized seem sort of weak, superficial, and not as full as it might be. The second kinds of reasons here I'm suggesting is that Christianity must be ecclesial, that is, have a church dimension to it, because God has revealed himself in history, wants his salvific presence to be visible and tangible. That's one of the things we'll see, especially in the class on the sacraments. That is, God deals with us according to our nature, and our nature is to be bodily creatures. We need the reminders. We need to have the tangible realities around us that make the message of Christianity clear to us. It's got to be seen someplace. You need signs of it. Otherwise, it's ethereal. It's floating around in the sky. It doesn't seem to be concrete and able to grab us. I believe that that's something that we are very strong on in the Catholic tradition. For us, the church can never just be an invisible reality. Church has got to be visible, because that's the way it touches us in mind and body. That's the kind of creatures we are. It's not good enough to be with people who somehow we think care about us or love us. Sometimes we need to hear it. We need the words. We need the touch. We need the interaction to make all of that concrete and real. All part of our nature, I think, as social beings. And the fact is that that is what we believe, that God's revealed himself in that way, continues to deal with us according to that physical, material nature that we have. He's revealed himself in history, and he needs to be present. There's a phrase from Karl Rahner that says, grace seeks visibility. God's blessings in the world try to concretize themselves, try to become available for us. Now, the next idea I want to take up is the question about whether Jesus really founded a church or not. And a lot of what I said about Jesus Christ would raise that kind of question. I can put it to you negatively. I don't think Jesus sat down the 12 one day and said something like this. Look, Peter, I want you to get to Rome and establish an office there. What you ought to do is set up cardinals and have this whole bureaucracy. And remember, gang, I want you to have sacraments, and there's this many, 7, get it down. And here's the flow chart on what we ought to do. I mean, I think it's clear that Jesus didn't establish a church in that sense. He didn't give us that kind of institutional framework. But what does seem clear is that he did gather a group of 12. They were an inner circle. And out of that 12, one was clearly the boss, and that is Peter. And he did want them to go out and preach and teach. He told them to do that and to baptize people. And it seems that out of that kind of thrust, out of that commission from Jesus, then the church took on its own life. Then they went out and tried to live it out the way he thought it ought to be, or the way they thought he wanted it. And I think that then we find developed in the history of the church different ways of doing things. In the early church, you really had 3 different models of institutional life. You had a presbyter model in Jerusalem, where there was really a group of elders that ran the church. And in Corinth, Paul's community, you really had a charismatic community that functioned on its own, with each with its own gifts, and seemingly no one person or group totally in charge. And then you had the other kind of grouping in which you had one man who was the boss, that came to be known as the episcopus or the bishop. And that is the model that then prevailed in the early centuries. But I think it's important for us to see that there were competing models of church structure available there in the beginning. And only gradually did the community decide, indeed, how they wanted to function. And all throughout the church, we've seen debates about those kinds of questions, institutional questions. Can we have a married clergy or not, for example? All throughout history, there has been a married clergy. It appears as though St. Paul even talks about a woman who is listed as an apostle in his letters. We had women playing a very prominent role in the early church. Then we came upon a period where women didn't play a very prominent role. Maybe we'll talk more about that as we go along. And so we see changes throughout that history. The number of sacraments has been debated throughout history. I'll talk about that next class as well. So it seems as though we've got just a thrust from Jesus to go out and preach and to baptize, and then we've got the community figuring out how it's going to do that. Well, you can see what that does right away is relativize much of the way that we operate. There isn't much around, I don't think, that isn't subject to change when you begin looking at it like that. If you think Jesus printed it all out, there'd be no women priests in my church, or this is the way all the 7 sacraments are supposed to be celebrated, then one would think, aha, we can't deviate. But once we see this developmental approach, it becomes clear that not much is absolute, that a whole lot of change is possible. And indeed, I believe that we are only at the beginning of the changes in the modern world. My Reflections article this week is on reminiscing about Second Vatican Council. And I'm saying in there that it is clearly not an end or a blueprint even for today, but it's only the beginning of the new era. That now we're only starting the changes. My father always used to say to me, "Son, when are you going to put the lid on all of this?" And I used to say, "Dad, there isn't going to be any lid on it. We live in a world of accelerating change, or the church has to keep adapting itself." And I believe that the changes coming in the years ahead will make the previous ones look rather minor. I think that we are just into a new kind of era. We're starting the new age of the church, in which for the first time the church will become a universal church. You realize what it will mean to enculturate Christianity in Africa and Asia in an indigenous fashion, using their customs and cultures, their outlooks. Can you imagine what the church might look like in China as it begins to take root there? And the kind of pluralism that we'll come to know, and the way our own outlook would be enriched by having a distinctive Chinese Christianity, a real distinctive African Christianity. There's no end to what that might do in terms of our own understanding of things. We're just, in my opinion, on the verge of the new era. We're just starting it and not winding it up as some people tend to think today. So exciting times are ahead, and it's based on a theology that says not much is absolute in this whole picture. Maybe some things we'll have to end up thinking are absolute. There are certain structures that appear to me to be essential. That is, that there is a leadership in the church, and that indeed one somehow exercises the leadership role among all of those. It could be done in varying ways, of course. Seems to me necessary that we have a sacramental structure. We may be able to talk about the numbers of sacraments in different ways and talk about the way they're celebrated far differently. The Eucharist in the Maasai tribe in Africa, the way it's celebrated, probably none of us would recognize it as the Mass. As I recall, it's an all-day kind of celebration, not a 45 or 1 minute job or 1 hour. All day, very different kinds of rituals connected with it, but the same essential notion that it's their way of making Jesus Christ present. Can you imagine how that will enrich our understanding of things? Indeed, then, I try to say something about this long history that prepares us for this coming of the new age. Say here, after the resurrection and Pentecost, a community of followers of Jesus was formed in Jerusalem. From there, the movement spread to other cities, especially Antioch. Paul's the great missionary force there. Now, we should see that two of the most important events happened right there in the first century. You realize the early followers of Jesus are all Jewish people, and they continue to function in the synagogue, to go to the synagogue as time goes on. And in fact, there is the feeling that they have to follow Jewish laws in order to be a follower of Jesus. The dominant Jewish tradition saw them as an heretical group within Judaism, and that's why Paul was persecuting them, because they were heretics. And there were people around who said even when he preached to the Gentiles, things would have to somehow be kept in line. They'd have to follow the Jewish laws. And then the first great council of the church occurred in year 49 in Jerusalem, and they got together and hammered this out. And Paul was on the side of universalism, saying, no, we can't impose the Jewish law on these people. It's not circumcision that counts. It's baptism in the Lord Jesus. You know, when you read in the epistles, that's the background in Galatians and Romans. Why he keeps saying circumcision isn't important. The summary rite of the Jewish law, that's not it. It's baptism into the Lord Jesus Christ. It's the Spirit that counts. And he won the day at the council. He had to compromise a little bit on dietary matters, but his vision and principles carried the day, and indeed the first movement away from exclusivism and towards universalism occurred. Second great event in the first century was the perception on the part of the followers that indeed the end of the world was not coming soon. They anticipated that. They were expecting Jesus to come. They were remembering his statements about this generation will not pass away till all these things happen. And so they were ready for that. And as the decades went on and we move into the 50s and 60s, 70s, they're starting to say, hey, people are passing away, and it hasn't happened yet. And somewhere along the line there, the perception grew, we don't know when the end is coming. They remembered that statement of the Lord, the Son of Man doesn't know, the angels don't know, only the Father knows. And there came another great revolution in the whole history of the church right there, where they started taking the long view instead of concentrating just on a few years in preparation for Jesus' second coming. So I say there that Paul, from about 45 to 65, spread Christianity to Europe, establishing small communities like at Corinth, for example. And then Paul writes those letters back to those people, telling them about when they're having trouble, how they're supposed to shape up, what their problems are, the doctrinal things they should keep in mind. Those are those wonderful epistles that we have of St. Paul that we read at Mass, letters to his Christian communities that he had founded. And then I just sort of sweep through those subsequent church history there. The persecutions under the Roman emperors of the first century. Big event in 311, the joining of church and state. And you got to remember, before, the Christian group in the early centuries is an outlaw group, a group that has to go underground, a dissident group. They don't fit into the dominant culture. That's why they're persecuted. And then Constantine comes along, needs some glue to hold the empire together, needs a dominant religion to really give cohesion to his whole kingdom, and he chooses Christianity to do that, and Christianity therefore gets wedded to the state. Some people feel that that's one of the worst things that ever happened to Christianity, that we never recovered from 311. That's why we had the French Revolution, and that at that time the church fell with the aristocracy. Had that in Latin America till the recent past. Church identified with state. Had that in the Inquisition in Spain in the late Middle Ages, 15th, 16th, 17th century, where that amalgam of the church and state, the church lost its ability to critique the culture, to critique the government, to say there's a higher power, that the cross is judge of the flag. It all became one. Church people became, like the people who get invited to the White House for prayer meetings. And when you do that, it's hard to become critical of the man sitting in the Oval Office there, the whole governmental structure. So we are the heirs, really, of that Constantinian revolution there in 311. And then we see something about the splits. Today we've got all different denominations of Christians and so on, and that's really started back there in 1054 when the East and West split for a lot of political, economic, social reasons, also some religious ones, and that's when we ended up getting the Orthodox Christians. The Orthodox Christians have all the same kind of things that Roman Catholics have, the 7 sacraments, bishops, all the rituals, ceremonial, and so on, but they do not recognize the primacy of the Pope. They have valid orders in our mind and valid sacraments, the whole thing, but they are not under the jurisdiction of the Pope, and they refuse to do that. One of the theories about John Paul II, the current Pope, is that one of his great ideals for his reign is to get the Orthodox united with Rome again. That's one of the grand strategies in his mind. One of the reasons he would be so strongly against women's ordination, for example, that he would feel that that is what would keep us from uniting with the Orthodox, who are very much against women's ordination as well. Well, be that as it may, that split occurred in 1054, and we are still plagued by that today. Then we know the 16th century, when the Reformation happened, Zwingli and Luther and Calvin felt the need to try to reform the church. They wanted to stay in the church and make it better, but they kept getting painted into a corner. The leaders wouldn't listen to them. The leaders wanted to take a hard line, and before long it's almost as though they got pushed out of the church, or at least couldn't find any kind of alternative. Someone once said that if Pope John the 23rd had been Pope in the time of Luther, we would have never had a Reformation. That all we needed was somebody with a big heart and some kindness to go and put his arm around somebody and say, hey, let's talk it over. Let's see what we can do about reforming this church together. Let's work at it. But that didn't happen, unfortunately, so we ended up with the Protestant Reformation, and there we got, 100 different Christian denominations in the United States now. Once the whole of Christendom began to get fragmented, it just kept breaking up more and more denominations. If one group didn't like what the dominant group was doing, they said, let's go elsewhere and we'll start our own church, and it just keeps proliferating like that, to the point today where many of us feel that it is time for a reversal of that, for groups to come back together. We see the Lutheran Church is doing that now. Major merger beginning among various Lutheran, not the Missouri Synod, but the other branches of Lutheranism. Part of this movement to come back the other direction now, move towards greater unity. Then I talk about, move all the way to our own century, the modern ecumenical movement, which is finally putting away the defensive posture of the past, which is saying something like, we've been fighting for 400 years between Catholics and Protestants, let's stop it, it's enough now. When I studied in a seminary, which was a long time ago now, I guess, way back there in the late 50s and early 60s, we studied almost a totally polemical or defensive kind of theology. Everything was designed to show how the Protestants were wrong. There'd be a thesis that would say there's 7 sacraments against Luther, who said there's 2 or 3. Then there would be a Bible quote, and then there would be a statement from the Council of Trent saying there are 7 sacraments. And you'd memorize all that and take a test on it. It was all defensive theology, and that continued all the way up to when I was ordained in 1962 and beyond. That's the first year of the Second Vatican Council, which really is the ending of the Counter-Reformation, the fight between the Catholics and the Protestants, the beginning of a new era of cooperation. Well, really, that had seeds in the intellectual world and the theological world back through the 20th century, but it only became very real in the popular mind just a few decades ago now, where we said, let's quit fighting, we got more in common, and we got that's different among us, and let's get together. So one of the purposes for this course, you can bring in a Lutheran theologian, Presbyterian theologian, confirm almost everything that I have said so far. Well, to say we got about 95% in common, there's no sense in fighting for much 5%. Karl Rahner's solution is this. He says, what we ought to do is just declare ourselves united. Remember the senator who said, let's leave Vietnam and say we won, and go home. It's like Karl Rahner says, forget all the fighting and what the leaders, let's just declare ourselves united. Because even in the Catholic Church, we don't demand that much unity. We've got all kinds of opinions in the Catholic Church, all kinds of diversity of piety, theology, philosophies, liturgical practices. Why demand more of other groups? And many people feel this way. Let's get united tomorrow, and then figure out why we did it later on. And find out anyway, we have the modern ecumenical movement. Finally, the modern charismatic movement in the 1960s with just a handful of people sitting around and praying for the Holy Spirit and experiencing great, wonderful gifts in themselves, spread from there up to Ann Arbor and to the University of Notre Dame. This is a very Midwestern kind of movement, or Great Lakes area movement. Now today we've got something like a couple million people who call themselves charismatics, people who are filled with the Spirit, who love to pray with their arms up in the air, and read their Bibles. And I was at a convention in Notre Dame with maybe 30,000 people in the football stadium at a mass. All kinds of outpourings of form of Christianity, right within the mainline Christian churches generally. So that is our modern charismatic movement, which is spreading. Well, that is sort of a brief summary of church history. I'm not so sure how much of that is of total and absorbing interest, And yet it does seem important somehow to have a feel for it, to have some sense of where we've been, where our roots are, how we came to be fragmented, how we try to get back together again. Why don't we do a one-on-one discussion for a couple of minutes and just see if any of that seems relevant to you that I can try to discuss. The question is asked about how we are going to get unity with those people who seem to deny more elements of the common Christian tradition to talk about Calvinistic rejection of real presence and so on. Well, I think that the process, first of all, will happen when people who are most alike will come together. That's why the Anglican-Catholic dialogue right now is so important. A friend of mine has been meeting with a group of 11 people for the last, 8, 10 years, hammering out agreements on almost every major issue, Anglican-Catholic dialogue. It's sitting on the desk of the leaders right now, just ready to be acted upon. It's all there. The Anglicans are ready to admit a certain primacy to the Pope, to the Bishop of Rome, and so on. And it's ready, except leadership is sitting on it. Now, with the groups that are more different, I believe that the process will be slower there. There's more to harmonize, less that we have in common. But I really need to correct some images about real presence there. As a matter of fact, Calvin did not deny the real presence at all. And the Calvinistic tradition shouldn't deny it. And I'm not sure that any Protestant person of any background wants to say something like this. When we do share the Lord's Supper, Jesus Christ is not present. It's absurd, isn't it? No, it's not. In other words, you start to think of it like that, I'm not so sure we're as far apart as you think. There's dialogue between Catholics and Methodists, for example, where there's great agreement on the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. As soon as you get away from the old arguments, Catholics saying you have to believe in transubstantiation, and Protestants saying, no, he's only symbolically present. That's how the arguments often went. As soon as you redefine it and start talking about it, you can see, you just put in common sense terms, nobody wants to say that Jesus Christ isn't present in the Eucharist when the Lord's Supper is celebrated. And Catholics are not bound to say we know exactly how it happens in some neat formula like transubstantiation or any of the other ways. As soon as you get beyond those 2 points, you're very close to unity. So any of the Christian groups, it seems, that celebrates the Lord's Supper, we have already, this isn't theoretical, this has been done at the level of dialogue and hammered out by theologians over many years back. We have a common catechism that I suggest you reading. A lot of these bilaterals, as we call them, are printed in there. And you can see the summary statements of Catholics, Lutherans, Catholic Anglicans, Catholics, Methodists, and so on about these major issues. And what you find is you put the right theologians in the room, you got 95 or more % agreement, all the way up to almost 100% agreement. And so much of that is really a fighting over past things. I had another question over here I want to try to respond to, and that is, with showing such great openness to the Protestant world within the Catholic Church, why is it that we are taking such a hard line with traditionalists within our own Catholic community? Well, I believe that there needs to be a lot of empathy for the traditionalists, the people who liked the Mass the way it was and who liked Latin and liked the whole classical church. I remember giving a talk in Chicago one time, and a woman came up to me and said, Father, I got a real problem. My grandfather, he's getting old and ready to die, and he keeps insisting on the fact that he have a Latin Mass for his funeral. What should I do about it? She wanted me to give her advice on how to talk him out of it. And I said, well, if I was the priest involved, the first thing I would do for your grandfather is tell him, I'll have your Mass, and I'll have it in Latin just like you want to have it. In other words, there's no sense in not helping those kind of people pastorally. There's no sense in taking a hard line. There's people have religious sensibilities that have to be respected in one way or another. And therefore, I think that probably we could use more toleration within the church as far as those who are more traditional. I don't think there has to be just one way of doing it. You see, what you learn when you study church history is that the church has always been pluralistic. That is, there's always been different options, different ways of doing things, different philosophies, theologies, pieties, and institutional structures. That's always been the case. It's only a 20th century notion that really ended up thinking it was all monolithic, one, that everything had to be the same. And we're just now learning to appreciate that pluralism and be not only tolerant of it, but celebrate it. Be happy that there's differences. It's good that not everyone thinks the same. If we were all Ronarians, the world would be a mess. You know, if we were all traditionalist Catholics, we'd have problems as well. It seems that we're at our best when we've got different viewpoints that can able to be expressed and lived out, and where we really celebrate that and are happy for the challenge that comes from people who think differently from ourselves. I'm going to limit the questions there and move on, and we'll have a number of other breaks here and perhaps be able to give more chance for questions then. The whole next part of my presentation it follows a pattern. It's really based on a very fine book by Avery Dulles called Models of the Church. Every now and then a theologian is able to summarize the whole raft of theological opinions and insights and work that's been done over the years and bring it together in an understandable whole. And that's what Avery Dulles has done in his book Models of the Church. And so I am not loath at all to just borrow his framework for making my comments about the church. He says there are these various models of the church, that is, various ways of viewing the church. And I want to describe those now and try to help us to use as a frame for understanding more about the church. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here and talk a little bit about B, the church as the institution. And I'm going to do that because I suspect that in the room there are a lot of people who grew up thinking of the church almost totally in institutional terms. In other words, the church was a perfect society. The church was identified with the bishops and with the pope. It was what we often call a pyramidal structure. Up at the top was the pope. And he sort of gave the directions to the group underneath him, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, people like me, and then we told the lay people what to do and believe. Large role of the laity was to be passive and dependent. And what held that system together was really the whole question of infallibility. The conviction by the people at the bottom of the pyramid that the guy at the top was right, knew what he was doing. I learned the emotional import of this years ago. Some people here might remember I used to write articles for the Catholic Chronicle before I got fired from that position. And I used to, when I would write about infallibility, my hate mail would pick up dramatically. And I really couldn't understand that, of why people would get so upset when I would write about infallibility. I mean, it seemed like a rather academic argument I was presenting. Why would people get so emotional? And it's then that I really figured out why, and that is because infallibility wasn't just a doctrine to them. It was a security blanket. It was the guarantee that the way they were living and trying to believe and act really was guaranteed to be correct. That it couldn't be wrong because the guy at the top was preserved from error. Fallibility was the cement, in a sense, that held the whole system together. It's much as inerrancy functions for fundamentalists today. That is, when you dialogue with the fundamentalists, they get very upset if you show any kind of possible error in the Bible. They must defend that. Why? Because that's the cement that holds it together. That's the worldview that says, I'm right, I've got the truth, I've got something solid to hang on to. I think that's the best way to be able to get hold of this, what infallibility meant or does still mean to many classical Catholics. Now, that's sort of a caricature, and yet many people listening to me can recognize that, can feel as though they were brought up that way. They know that world I'm describing there, in which the church is really almost identified with the church leaders or the Pope. In fact, I still encounter people today who will talk about it that way. They'll say, well, what does the church hold on birth control? And what they really mean is, what does the Pope hold on birth control, or what does the bishops hold on birth control? Not meaning the church as the whole community or people of God. Now, so we got a problem, in other words, with the institutional model of the church. It's really distorted the meaning of the church for many people. Well, what are we going to do about that? Well, some people say throw out the institution, on a free church. And I would say rather what I would like to think is that we need an institutional church. We need it because we need to be rooted. We need to know who we are and where we fit, because it's good to be part of a larger grouping, because you need power in the world in order to work for social justice. You need an organization to be able to do that. You need institutional church because it's just necessary for us human beings to have one. I remember being on a panel television show one time with a guy who said, denied all this stuff. And he began to say, don't need all that. All you need is to read your Bible, get rid of all the church structures, institutions. And I told him, that's really not possible. Can't do that because of our social nature. And I said, you watch what will happen to your own group. Well, sure enough, I watched from a distance over the years. Before long, he was ordained as the head of the group. And they met on a certain night. And they began to develop a ritual about the way to do things. And they had committees on how to handle things. And he got a license in order to be able to marry people. Before long, he had a more rigid structure than we had in the Catholic community. He had a structure in which they were trying to tell almost everybody what to do all the time. In other words, it's built into the whole ecclesial sense of Christianity. You just can't get away from it. We need to be rooted. We need structure in our lives. We only have such a tolerance for chaos, all of us. We got limits as to how much chaos we can really deal with. We need to find that rooted togetherness and ability to have a larger frame to function in. Now, that's where I'd like to say that we could use the church structure and institution. Rather than get rid of it, what we need to happen is for the institution to function for us, to further the causes of Christianity. We need more of like when the Pope went to the UN, Pope Paul VI, and said, never any more war, no more war. And we need somebody to be a moral spokesman for the gospel ideals. We need to be able to galvanize our energies to do some good. And one of the neat things about the Catholic Church is that every year we have a campaign for human development. And we collected over $80 million now over the last 10 years for self-help programs for the poor, so that people who want to help themselves can get a start with a grant of some money and get on with it. Well, now that's a neat thing to do. An individual can't do that kind of thing. A bunch of people walking in the woods can't do that kind of thing. But an institutional church is able to mount that kind of campaign, which indeed then tells us that it's possible to do something about poverty in our country. Institutions could end up serving us, helping us. Now, one of the things that Vatican II tried to do, of course, was to move beyond that image. It kept the notion of an institutional church, but it tried to surround it by other images of what the church ought to be all about. Now, if the church is going to function in this more positive way, it's vital to do a number of things. One is you have to rethink infallibility. Some people think infallibility means the Pope gets up in the morning and says it's going to rain, and by golly, it rains. No, that is an extreme version of this, and we need to rethink it, reinterpret it. There's a big debate about this in contemporary theology, and we don't have real agreement. Karl Rahner, my own mentor, and Hans Kung argued vociferously about this. In fact, they got mad at each other over all of this and trying to figure out what infallibility meant. So we don't have consensus. But one thing they have to see is an historical perspective. The doctrine of infallibility was not proclaimed till 1870 at the First Vatican Council. And since 1870 at that First Vatican Council, it's been exercised clearly only once. That was in 1950 with the doctrine of the Assumption. Now, isn't that remarkable? You know, this whole thing of infallibility, the glue that holds it all together, was defined in 1870 and exercised once in all of that time, just to give it more force. 16 documents produced by the Second Vatican Council over a 4-year period. Not one new infallible statement made. Humanae Vitae, the birth control encyclical, which has so much influence on people's lives in the past. When it was given in 1968, it was explicitly said in the press conference that that document was not meant to be infallible. Again, a way to help you get it all into perspective. It's just not that big a thing as some people might want to make it. On the other hand, we have to say, what does it mean positively? Well, there's been various efforts to say that. One might be this, that indeed God, and this is from the Second Vatican Council, that God has so anointed the whole church, the people of God, the total community, that in matters of faith and morals, that whole group of people cannot err. In other words, it's the sense that the church, the community following Jesus, will somehow be on the right track, somehow head in the right direction, despite errors, despite mistakes, limitations, and all of that. The church will fundamentally remain true to the spirit of the gospel. And the question arises, can any statement be made about that? Hans Kung is just so strong on saying that in his opinion you can't have a sentence that is infallibly true. That language just doesn't have that kind of force or power. My own mentor, Karl Rahner, thinks that indeed you can make a statement that infallibly captures the truth, so that you could say that in my heart I know that other human beings should be respected as people and not used as things. And that could infallibly capture both your sense of it and the reality. Why couldn't you? You might be able to say it better, you'd improve it, say it better later on, but why couldn't that capture the reality? And Rahner says, why couldn't the church as a whole, at some point in its history, make statements that indeed capture the fundamental truth of the gospel and make it available for the people of the age? But even if you admit that, what is clear is that we don't need a lot of infallible statements now, and the popes are very leery of exercising that office ever since it was proclaimed that they had that kind of power. They can only do it in consensus with the rest of the church and only in trying to proclaim fundamental notions of the faith that are at the center of the gospel. So maybe when we begin to talk like that, it's not such a hard idea to accept. In fact, as part of the Catholic-Lutheran dialogue, in which Lutherans show a certain openness to that new interpretation of infallibility, showing how indeed we're coming far closer together than some people ever thought was possible. Then in B here, say the leaders must be servants. Try to say what the role of the Pope might be. You know, the Pope doesn't have to live in Rome, and he doesn't have to dress in funny clothes or be carried around in a throne or be called Your Holiness. It seems as though in our Catholic sense of things, however, that it is good to have a spokesman for the group, to have one person who sort of can pull together the gospel values, who's the focal point of unity for the whole community. That is part of the Catholic sense that it's good to have a guy like that. And indeed, when Pope John XXIII was Pope, there were many Protestants who would say, when Pope John speaks, he speaks for me. I have the feeling that if he had remained Pope, stayed alive for a little longer, that we would be far further along the road to unity right now. So many in the Protestant world understand now that it's good to have a leader, that this fragmentation just reduces our power to help the world deal with peace and war and racial problems, hunger, and all of that. What I'm saying here is the leaders must be servants. Our Pope's really great title is the servant of the servants of God. And all the bishops, priests, right down the line, have to think of themselves not as lording it over the community, but as orchestrating the talents of the community. That seems to be a style of leadership that we need. If they gave me one shot at doing one thing in terms of institutional reform right now, what I would institute is popular election of bishops. It seems to me that would be a way for us to move forward and to get off dead center and make the renewal real. What we need is those powerful kinds of figures. We're so lucky in the Diocese of Toledo with our Bishop Jim Hoffman now. Terrific man, and has this style of leadership, as many people know. Openness to the people, availability, consensus kind of decision making, and so on. I think those are the kind of democratic procedures that we need in the church. See, the church got its institutional model from kings when monarchies were in. Now, monarchies aren't in most places now. Democratic procedures are. And it seems wise for the church to be able to incorporate those into its life and structure. And finally, I try to say here that the laws must not be seen as ends in themselves, but as serving the needs of the people. And I think that there's this common saying in Catholicism that people in Rome make the laws, but the only people who keep them are Americans. In other words, in Italy, they know that you shouldn't take them with extreme seriousness. Or you shouldn't really get carried away with them. And it's only Americans who have some other kind of attitude towards it, who think they got to keep all the minute laws of the church. And I think there's a great virtue, Christian virtue, called epikeia. Epikeia is the virtue celebrated by Thomas Aquinas and others, which says that we must know how and when to prudently break the laws. And said, I learned that from my father a long time ago, that unreasonable laws should be challenged and need to be broken periodically. And that seems to be a healthy Christian outlook, really. Virtue of epikeia. A friend of mine, a psychologist, keeps that on his wall. People want to know what that means. And that is indeed an important kind of virtue. And it's a way of me highlighting the fact that laws are not absolute. We can make too much out of all these church laws. You know, there's a book with them with over 2,000 of them in the book, and they're revising it. And there's a new group coming out soon, within the next few months, or this coming year. Like we need more laws somehow. Well, that is a revision of the laws. Now, you know, my own opinion would be, how can you have one law that makes sense for Africa, Asia, and the United States in the church today? I don't see how you can get very specific and have laws that make sense in those various cultures. I really don't think we need a new code of canon law, although we're getting one within the next year, which hopefully will be revised and be a little more realistic than the last list made up in 1917 of over 2,000 of them. All right, let me pause there again. Let's do our one-to-one discussion for a minute and see if there's any questions.
Remember, I think that's a long playing tape. It'll probably go for a while.
So we're down to 7th class. We've decided to eat after we've worked for a while. There's a say in the syllabus that we've tried to get to speak, first of all, in general terms about what Christianity is all about. I really believe that many of the things that we've said in here, maybe like 98%, would be acceptable to a liberal Protestant theologian who works out of the contemporary approach that we've talked about. In fact, we would probably say that if we put the right contemporary Protestant theologian in the room, say a Lutheran, and a classical Catholic theologian, I would find myself very often being closer to the liberal Protestant than I would to the classical Catholic, which is a very new situation. In other words, the new boundaries that really exist in our world today are not the strict denominational boundaries we knew in the past.
but they are more according to mindset and worldview and dominant approaches to what religion is all about. So that probably becomes clear as we've gone through this, that my insistence on beginning in human experience, beginning first of all with who are we and what we are about, and always trying to link up our experience with what the wisdom of the tradition has said. That's a predominantly contemporary approach. And there would be some Protestants who would say, right on, I like that, that's the way I do it too. They would be the followers of Paul Tillich, for example. On the other hand, certain Catholic thinkers would be much more, want to say, but first we got to say what the Church says. First we got to get clear what the Church's doctrine and dogma is, and its teaching on morality, then we could begin to apply it. You've sort of mixed that up. So when we start thinking in this last class about things specifically Catholic, it is with certain qualifications. And it is at the end of a long period where we've spent 6 classes trying to deal with what we have together, what we have in common as Christian people, and trying to see it from the perspective of contemporary thought. Now, the burden of this class is to try to get a sense or a feel for the Catholic thing, for the Catholic people, for what the shape of Catholicism, the sensibilities of it, the imaginative structure that goes to make up Catholicism. And to do that, I have to play it off against other viewpoints, and predominantly against the Protestant viewpoint. While even though we would find great similarities with Protestant theologians, we would still find certain sensibilities and emphasis points that may well be different. Now, in doing this, I'm trying to be cautious about this whole approach. As I suggested, there's a lot of people who I would think of as being ecumenical Christians these days. And I think a lot of people on campuses are like that. They sort of have drunk in sensibilities from a lot of different sectors. It isn't just a matter of growing up in a Catholic ghetto and thinking in Catholic terms all the time, but it's rubbing shoulders with other people and maybe going to other services and knowing very well people of a different religious background, and that begins to blur the sharp distinctions that we would ordinarily find. So it becomes, I suppose, very hard to see anymore whether these things exist or not. So my approach is to define some of these differences that are at least there potentially, and then I want to stop with each one and see if it rings any bells with people or not. Whether you could say, well, yeah, that is a difference, or I don't find myself in this camp at all. This might be sort of interesting way to go about it. And also, you'll notice that I'm suggesting that Catholics in different parts of the world would be very different. If you've been down in Mexico, for example, and seen the Mexican people crawl on their knees up to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, for long distances and up steps and, with their knees bleeding and so on, and you see the devotion to the Virgin Mary and how much important Mary is, well, you begin to wonder. Or if you were in Oxford, as I was, and went to masses there at Oxford, and to see the great reserve and sort of rational approach to what Catholicism is all about, you'd say, I wonder if this is the same religion, in a way, as those people crawling on their knees in this very staid group of people in a church, a Catholic church in Oxford. So the cultural differences would have to be noted. And then there's also the historical differences. That is, that Catholicism looked different in 1960 when I was in the seminary than it does now. It was a very closed system. When I was in the seminary in 1960, the theologians I'm talking about, like Teilhard de Chardin, we were not even allowed to read them. Mass looked very different, as we've said before. We knew Latin, studied in Latin. the Catholic world was just very different. And now since the council, so historical differences. So. And then there would be the personal differences that occur. You can think of any of Catholic people you know. And, you know, one would be a regular Mass goer every day and say the Rosary every day, so on. And you could think of another person who calls themselves Catholic, who they come to Mass a few times a year, Christmas, Easter, a few other times. They really never say the Rosary or anything like that. They might read the Bible now and then, so on. And you just wonder, well, are these Catholics? So the first thing you see is that this Catholic thing, Catholic people, is a vast, great, large sort of thing. It's an amazing amalgam of different outlooks and worldviews and theologies and so on. And then I suggest here that Catholics living in the United States are very different because we have lived in a Protestant country all this time. The United States is predominantly a Calvinistic country. It's a thought of John Calvin that has primarily influenced how the ethos of the United States. And we've been in that atmosphere for a long time, and before long it begins to influence us. And then I suggest that even within the United States we could think of various groupings. I say distinguish out conservatives who want to preserve things, progressives who want change, charismatics who are much more emotional in their outlook, and communal Catholics who are the kind of people I just described who would go to Mass pretty regularly, but they don't much care what bishops and popes say. They're not terribly interested in that. And they're not mad about the Pope anymore. They used to be years ago, but they're not mad anymore. They just don't much care. But if they go to a hospital and they say, "What are you?" they say, "I'm a Catholic," and no one's going to kick them out of the church. And they sort of take what they like out of it. And a lot of these people go to Mass pretty regularly, but you know, if the bishops say something that they disagree with, they forget it. And if they say something they like, they tend to latch on to it. We have a word for those. Andrew Greeley has described those as selective Catholics or communal Catholics, and there appear to be large numbers of those. I must say, even when I give lectures to priests and so on, I sometimes talk about this, and surely some priests will come up afterwards and say something about, "I hate to say this, but I myself am one of those communal Catholics." You know, so it's not just lay people in a sense that fall into that category. So all those are sort of caveats, things to be aware of as we look at this question. And then I say, still, I think it's possible to draw a certain profile. And then what I do is to take up these various characteristics, which is what I want to do, comment on them, and then I want to get your reactions to them to see if they make sense or not, or whether they're still in place. Anybody want to ask me anything up to that point, sort of a theoretical background for this? Okay, first thing is an appreciation of the Petrine office. That is, there's a sense in the Catholic community. Yeah, Julius, you want one of these? There's a sense in the Catholic community that it's good to have a focal point of unity, that it's good to have a spokesman for the group. And that if we're going to have somebody like that, the best claimant to that job is the Bishop of Rome, and that there's a long tradition with all of this and so on. Now, in general, again, I'm playing this off usually against the Protestant community. The Protestant community, there's less of a sense of that. In other words, there's been a sense we don't need that fellow. He gets in our way. He messes us up. He keeps us from being autonomous. He makes these infallible statements that we don't agree with and so on. We don't like the way he acts a lot of time. We think he's too above us all and so on. So I think that here, you know, we see a slight difference. Now, I mean, there's different sides to this thing. I mean, there's some Catholics who are saying, "Man, I'm not too thrilled with this guy myself." And there's a lot of Catholics who will say, "Well, I think it should change. I don't think he should be carried around on a throne, and I don't think we should be calling him Your Holiness, and I think he ought to be more in touch with the people or elected in a more democratic way or something." You know, there'd be a lot of people saying that in the Catholic community. On the other hand, I remember when Pope John the 23rd was the Pope, there were many Protestants who said at that time, when he speaks for me. Or if that's what the Pope was like, then we could use somebody like that. And there's the Protestant community today generally is sensing that there would be better if we had somebody who could pull it together and so on. So that's the first possible difference, that in the Catholic community against, say, Lutherans or Anglicans, or surely against Baptists, over against Baptists, that there's a stronger sense of having a successor to St. Peter, a spokesman for the group. Comments on that, or questions, fill in, whatever.
I guess a lot of Protestants feel that God is their spokesperson, and it seems that way. And like you said, that anyone else would just be in the way because they feel that, it's between them and God. And,
Right.
and even if they feel the leader of their church isn't doing what they like, then they'll move him out and get somebody new in.
Yes. Very sense of freedom that way. I say a very important point, that is this sense of mediatorship. And, Protestants is a much more direct sense of God relationship, God-human relationship, and not the need for the in-betweens, like sacraments. And we'll see that in a number of places here. I think that's probably a real general difference that maybe could be spelled out better.
But we were talking in our honors class, and everyone, most of us are Catholic, but I could not defend. They were saying that the Pope really is not what Jesus would be if he were on here. That Jesus would really, not approve of the Pope at all because of the grandiose lifestyle and everything. And I really couldn't defend him, and I felt kind of bad about that. But how can we defend it?
Well, I don't think you can.
Just say, okay, I guess we're all wrong.
Well, I mean, to say that you couldn't defend a lifestyle wouldn't mean to say that it's all wrong. In other words, you'd have to have a more nuanced judgment. In other words, I would say something like this, that I wouldn't want to defend the lifestyle, and I wouldn't want to defend the titles. I wouldn't want to defend that he's got to live in Rome, or 100 other things like that. I would want to defend that it makes sense for the Christian world to have a spokesman. It makes sense to have somebody who can come to the United Nations and say, no more war. Or for somebody to speak out in favor of the poor people in the world, someone who's got power and clout. That's what makes sense. That's one way of defending it. The other way you can defend it is historically, that is, in the community of Jesus, that one did have preeminence. And that's Peter. As we find in the New Testament, the Protestant scholarly world recognizes that as well. That Jesus' community was structured. There was 12 special leaders, but out of those 12, one was the clear leader of all, and that was Peter. And that in the Catholic community, we've kept that structure. So you could argue it on two grounds. One is New Testament basis. That's the structure of the church in the New Testament. Secondly, pragmatically, that is, it works well, works better. You have less splintering then.
That's exactly what I said.
Yeah, good argument. I mean, and the thing is that many Protestants feel that these days. I was talking to a Baptist thinker, quite a fine one really, who was saying that, they could never have, like we have, a campaign for human development, where we collect $8 million on one Sunday around the United States and give it for the poor. He said, in the Baptist community, we could never do that. We couldn't get Baptist communities to agree on doing that. Or you don't have one person who could get them all to do that. They are too autonomous for that. Now that has certain advantages, but it has certain disadvantages. I think the Protestant world sort of recognizes this today, that we can use a spokesman. Billy Graham said that. He said that the moral force in the world today, when Pope John Paul was running around the world saying good things he thought about peace and poverty and so on, that he was the spokesman for the Christian community, and that there's a value in that. But there's no need to defend all the rest of it. Well, I certainly wouldn't defend it. Well, I especially wouldn't like the way the notion that the Pope and the people in Rome should control everything around the world. Control things about, like, when kids in the United States make their first confession, whether they're going to do it before or after communion. Now, our bishops in the United States know what it's like here. They have important things to say about that, and more so than people sitting in Rome. So, I mean, I don't think that is defensible. That's my own opinion on it. So you need to make a nuanced judgment. Just because you wouldn't like lifestyle, you wouldn't say, well, throw it all out. The real thing is say, let's reform the lifestyle, or let's reform the approach.
How can you say that the Pope is infallible? And history shows, that they have made mistakes.
Well, for, a couple things about that. The infallibility question is an important one. I don't know if it comes up here in a particular place. Does it someplace I deal with that? Should have been someplace along the line in the notes so we could see a summary. But I mean, I will tell you, what's important about the infallibility thing is that, first of all, it was defined only in 1870 at the First Vatican Council. And since then, it's only been exercised once. That's clearly. One time. And that's the doctrine of the Assumption in 1950. So we're not dealing with thousands of infallible papal statements. We're really dealing with one since 1870 when infallibility was defined. So that's the first thing to remember. It's a very limited notion. Although there is a more general notion that the Church as a whole, as represented in councils and so on, is infallible. In fact, that's what the Second Vatican Council said, that the whole people of God, anointed as they are by the Spirit, cannot err in matters of faith. So you have to begin to broaden it out. It's not just papal infallibility that's been assumed throughout history. That's only since 1870. But there's a broader notion of infallibility that the Church as a whole, filled as it is with the Spirit, that it will fundamentally remain in the truth. Now you get a big debate about what this all means. The poles of the debate in Catholicism have been, on the one hand, Hans Kung, who says you can't have an infallible statement. It's impossible because language is too weak. The language, you could never be sure that the words meant exactly what you wanted them to mean. And so the very limits of language would keep you from ever making an infallible proposition or statement or sentence. Other people claim that no, it's possible, but we probably shouldn't do it, and that we don't need those kind of things today, or that they're the wrong way to proceed. So there's a whole history of error in the Church, no doubt about it. I mean, there's moral mistakes like crusades and inquisitions. There's sort of dogmatic mistakes like religious liberty, where we've said in the past that, well, you shouldn't have religious freedom. We ought to clamp down on people and make them believe, coerce them if necessary. Whereas in the Second Vatican Council we've said we don't want that coercion, we want freedom. So there's a change, there's a development throughout history. Paul told the slave to go back to his master in the New Testament. Told the slave to go back to his master. Today, we would say, well, we would never tell slaves to go back to their masters. We'd say slavery is wrong. So you take any question, you can see a development like that. And so the real context in which to look at that is the development of doctrine. So we begin always to, as time goes on, we might see a teaching of Jesus in the New Testament clearer than they saw it right at his time. In fact, there's no doubt that that's what we do very often. So there's a development. So infallibility can never mean that the Pope never makes a mistake, or if he says it's going to rain, it rains, or something. But that's never been the claim either. It's a very narrow claim for papal infallibility. One time, really. That's the Assumption in 1950. Since the doctrine was proclaimed in 1870. I tell you, there was a Pope in 1438, I think it was, who said that there was a group proclaiming that infallibility then, papal infallibility, and the Pope said, this whole idea of infallibility is nothing but an invention of the devil. So the Pope said in the 1400s. So knowing a little history is always helpful in these questions. So it's only, and in 1870 there was a big fight over it, of whether we were going to proclaim papal infallibility or not. There were a lot of people against it, and some important American bishops were against it. There's thoughts that Pope Pius IX, who did this, was senile at the time. And if he wasn't senile, he was sort of overly protective of his own authority. And that there was a lot of pressure put on the bishops to vote with him. So history is very important in understanding anything like this. I would say this, when I come down to it, I would say my own position is that you have to root this whole thing in the church. The idea of the church as a whole remaining faithful to the gospel, despite errors. Despite errors. Errors exist, but despite those errors, the church will fundamentally preserve the New Testament, will preserve the teachings of Jesus. And that's its task, and that it's helped by the Spirit to carry on that task. And I would say myself that it would be possible for the church at some time to come up with a statement that would capture its faith. And you'd say, yes, that's really true. Something like Jesus Christ is the Lord. I would say, now there's an infallibly true statement. But the problem is when you want to wander from that and get some peripheral, accidental matter and raise that up to a dogma like that, then you got trouble. I don't think the Pope should be making infallible statements now. And of course, we haven't only had one, so they're sort of keeping restrained on that. Difficult question, but an important one. Does that help? Did you follow me?
I understood that.
Good.
That would be nice if that were more publicly proclaimed, so more Catholics knew that. I know a lot of Protestants come up to me and ask me about it. I try to say, not so eloquently, but I try to say, I try to explain to them what that means, and that's been my impression through
very limited
12 years of Catholic education.
Now, see, my great hope is that someday someone will ask you that question now, and you'll be able to say something, you know, maybe you wouldn't remember all the dates, but you'd at least remember, hey, that's very limited. You know, it doesn't mean like there's a whole bunch of them. But you might even remember there's only one, you know, I mean, and you could say that, and you could say what it means. And then it makes a certain sense. In fact, there's probably a way in which many in the Protestant world would accept that. In fact, there's Catholic-Lutheran dialogue that's come very close on the question of infallibility. Now, that's probably hard for some people to believe, but it's true. Yeah.
What I found, because I took this last year, and since then I did run into someone who asked me about that, and I was so happy that I remembered 1870 and 1950 Assumption, all that sort of thing. And I think I explained it very clearly, and he said, oh, well, I mean, he almost couldn't believe that because it is such a common thing that the Pope is infallible. It's almost like he dismissed that as, well, you're just making it up, or, you know, if you're not making it up, then that's you, and that's the very small world of Corpus Christi, but that's nowhere else in the Catholic Church, or very few places in the Catholic Church.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, and it bears on our point very much here. With all religions, I don't care what they are, Hinduism, Buddhism, or the denominations of Christianity, there is a popular understanding, and there's a more sophisticated understanding. That always happens. In other words, there's very few Lutherans who know that Luther accepted the sacrament of penance. Most Lutherans think that Luther thought there should be two sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. But as a matter of fact, Luther was very open to the sacrament of penance and had a lot of positive things to say about it. Now, your average Lutheran doesn't know that. A Lutheran theologian would know it, and you'd like the average person to get to know it. So you can take any religion like that, and there will be a gap in understanding. So that's one thing to say about it. And the other thing is to recognize psychologically that it is true. Infallibility functioned psychologically in a different way in the Catholic Church. It was very big. In other words, it was what's said, we're right. We're right. We lay people can go by what the Pope says because we know he's right. And so in the popular mind, that is true. And therefore, you got another problem to attack, a passive dependency on the part of lay people. So what you need here is a statement, we're growing out of that. In a sense, you're right. Catholic people did use it as a crutch, as a security blanket, just as biblical fundamentalists use the scriptures. So the common statement was that the fundamentalists have a paper pope, because it does the same thing as the infallible pope. That is, make one feel secure that we got the answer. And so we have Catholic people now who still function that way, but we've got Catholic people growing out of that to a greater maturity that says, I must answer to my God myself. So that's another point to put in the puzzle here, or element to get out there. Yes, that's true. It did function psychologically as a security blanket, and for many Catholics, and still does for some, but we're trying to get beyond that, trying to educate ourselves better on this. That would help. Let me go on to the next one here. This gets, it's a lengthy thing, I think, on our syllabus, but I'll try to summarize it. That is a sense of tradition. That the Christian tradition is 2,000 years and not just since the Reformation. Now, this, and then I link this up with the whole sense of the doctrine of Mary and the saints as being part of this tradition and so on. It also relates to the way we talk about the Bible. Now let me just try to briefly put this together for you. Again, Protestant Catholic playoff. That when you go back to the Reformation, remember that was in the 16th century, right? You got that located Luther, Calvin, 16th century. Okay. And what they said is, look, the church is messed up, and the reason it's messed up is because we got all these traditions. And the way you get it straightened out is to get back to the Bible and have the Bible alone. If you just got the Bible, then you won't have all this messed up church. And in response, what the Catholic community said, so Luther was saying Scripture alone, Bible alone. The Catholic community said in turn, no, Scripture and tradition in the Council of Trent. And for 400 years, that was the battle. And so Catholics played down the Bible. If you went into a home and you saw a Bible on the coffee table, you'd say it was a Protestant home. And Catholics were big on tradition. And it was a big fight. Now, only in Second Vatican Council solved the fight, and so did other people before that in the 20th century. And they said, well, it's not either or, it's not the way it is. There is a tradition. The Bible doesn't come down from the sky. The community has a tradition. It lives a life, and it solves problems and teaches and proclaims. And then this community that had a tradition wrote it down, and that's how we have the Bible. But then the church continues its tradition of reading that Bible and studying it and so on. And so there is always a mixture of Scripture and tradition. They go together. And so now that's become common. So what have we got in the Catholic world? We've got a renewed interest in the Bible. So if you walk into a house now and there's a Bible on the coffee table, you don't know if you're in a Protestant or Catholic house. It's all kind of Catholics. If you hear the local congregation's got a Bible course, you don't assume it's a Lutheran group, because the Catholic Church has got all kind of Bible courses. So this has changed. So in the Catholic community, we've got a much greater appreciation of the Bible today. Whereas in the Protestant world, you're getting a greater appreciation of tradition and the way the tradition has shaped the biblical material. That is in the mainline Protestant churches. That's not in the fundamentalist groups, which are still back in a sort of archaic, old-time Scripture alone approach to this whole thing. But generally, in the main line, you get this coming together. So you begin to wonder, is this distinction blurred or not? You go into mainline churches on Sunday, Catholic, Episcopalian, Lutheran, Presbyterian, etc., and you'll hear the same scriptures read. We use common translations of the Bible, common scholarship. So all of that has come together in a way. And I guess the other issue that I took up in all of this was the whole understanding of Mary and the saints. And here I would say what we've got again is a greater perspective going within the Catholic community now. The key turning point was at the Second Vatican Council, when there were some people at the council who wanted to play up Mary and make her more and more important. And there were other people who said, no, Christ is the mediator. Christ, the only mediator between God and people. Mary's got to be fit into a scene as a member of the church. And that was a very close vote in the council. In fact, about the only close vote I can remember. And the progressives won the vote, and Mary's role was played down, and she became one chapter in the document on the church, and she was seen not as some special person with a lot of unique privileges, but as one of us, and saved by God's grace just as we are, and brought to heaven just as we will be one day. So she's seen as the prototype of the church, or as the guarantee of the fate and the grace that's available for us. Now, I'm going to stop there again and see questions, comments on, whatever this means. Tradition, do you identify with the tradition in any way? The saints, the renewed scripture study, or whatever?
It just kind of struck me that only by a few votes, my whole upbringing in the Catholic Church means that Mary was downplayed instead of, being a major figure. Just by a few votes.
It's interesting, yeah.
That human judgment could make.
Yeah, that's very. I will say this to put it in a little more context and so on. That what was happening, of course, at that time is there was a ferment theologically, and there was a lot of debate, and there was a way in which in the church as a whole, the more, and I'm calling it progressive in this case, you might want to call it something else, but that the progressive wing was gaining force. And there's a way in which even if the vote had gone the other way, you wouldn't, as we call them, the Marian maximalists, those are the people who wanted the most for Mary, they would have had a little lever, and they would have sort of stayed in business a little longer. But there was an historical trend against it. So while the council vote was crucial and gave leverage to the progressives and took away the momentum from the conservative element in this case, I think that the result would have been somewhat similar over the long haul. That's my own opinion. The vote was crucial, but the trends were already there. And Mary would have gotten put into a context anyway. And that doesn't mean, I think, for some people, if you go to a funeral home and they're saying the rosary there, you're in a Catholic setting. You're not in, and I personally think that something like the rosary will come back again. There will be a rebirth of interest in the rosary, because I say that out of a religious sense of things, because all religious traditions have had repetitive prayer, and there's other traditions that have the beads, because it's very psychologically calming. It's like a mantra. The repetition helps calm one, and it does a lot of good things. And so I think the rosary will, in a sense, come back in a way and become reintroduced maybe in a different fashion.
It's like the same like with some of the saints and stuff. If you think about them, just their life, you can relate to them a little easier, and so that our whole idea of looking to them.
Yeah. Well, I think the saints play a role. I place them in the category of the need for heroes. Our culture lacks heroes. We lack flesh and blood examples of what it means to live as a committed person. And we really need that because it's hard to know how you do it, and we need those heroes. That's why someone like Mother Teresa, I mean, we latch on to her. She's a saint in that way. People think of her as a holy person. She does good things. And what we're learning is that saints don't have to be perfect. I mean, Mother Teresa, some people don't like Mother Teresa's politics or lack of politics. You know, they say if she'd use her clout, she could get the Indian government to build stuff for the poor. So some people don't even like Mother Teresa. You know, I mean, so that there isn't any perfect people walking around. But what we think we do is latch onto a particular virtue and say, there's a person who lived it out effectively. Yeah, I mean, saints make a lot of sense to me. I'm not embarrassed by them at all. And one of the interesting ways of looking at all this is an outlook on embarrassment. Because there's a lot of things in Catholicism that to liberal Catholics could be embarrassing in a way. And that's why it's important to sort of get it into context. You know, I don't like the Inquisition and the Crusades, and I don't like the Pope with all the pomp and circumstance. But that doesn't mean that I can't see a positive role for the Pope. And I do think that there's ways of thinking about the saints that's out of line and doesn't make sense. But it makes perfect sense to me to raise up heroes. You know, when I left, I say this before, when I left Karl Rahner in Munich the last time, that's my mentor who I did my dissertation on and so influential on me, I wrote him a letter and I said, Pater Rahner, I want to thank you for enabling me to remain a Christian with intellectual honesty. And you know, I could have added, and to say that I could remain a Catholic without embarrassment. In other words, that what he showed me how to do was to get at the kernel of the teaching, to get at the essence of what the tradition is about, and to find what's good in there. And to realize that the historical accidents, the cultural accretions, are not the essence of it. You know, and that's sort of, I guess it would be a dominant point if you could take that away from here. There's a way to get in touch with the tradition that might well make sense. I mean, some people, for example, in tradition are embarrassed by purgatory. They say, well, purgatory, that's a weird doctrine. It doesn't mention purgatory in the Bible. Well, I don't have any trouble with it at all. It doesn't say purgatory by name, but it's got the whole of it, because in the Scriptures, what is clear is that we are sinful people as we walk this earth. And the other thing that is clear is that we will be united with God one day in a loving relationship where we're made whole and happy. And all purgatory is a statement that you got to get from here to there. In fact, if we didn't have a doctrine of purgatory, we'd have to invent it. Somehow we get from being imperfect at the moment of death to achieving a closeness with God in the afterlife. And all purgatory means is you get from here to there. The idea that souls go and burn up for 30 days or something is ridiculous in my mind. That is, I'd never hold that. I mean, there can't be that kind of time element in the afterlife. But to get from here to there is necessary. It's perfectly logical. It's reasonable. You got to have something like purgatory. That's why the Buddhists have something like reincarnation, because they know the same thing. You got to get from here to there. When people die, they're not perfect. And somehow they're going to get perfect, and so how are they going to do it? Well, they think they come back and live again. Do it over and over until they get perfect. Christians have purgatory. That is a sense we move through God's love and mercy from here to there. So what am I saying? It's an important general point that there's an embarrassment problem about the tradition, and often when you know more about it, know its history, and especially can detach the kernel of the truth that's in it, you can find out that it makes perfect sense or is defensible in conversation. Follow me?
How do we get in touch with this history and traditions of the church?
Well, one thing that I'm hoping is that when I do this book like this, is that a lot of that would be there, and there would be like I'd want to quote out of these various things. Well, the other lacking that, there's a one-volume paperback by Richard McBrien, who incidentally I was just talking to on the phone the other day, and is coming here to lecture next October 5th, I think it is. So I was very happy about it. He's the chairman of the theology department at Notre Dame, and he's written a fine one-volume book, Catholicism. And in that book, if you looked up a question, he often gives the history of it. And as I'm sitting here, I mean, it's thick, and it's now in paperback, probably costs you $14 or something, but there's probably as good as any one book to have to get at the history of these questions and what Catholics think about them. Because most books wouldn't have the history. They would just have the conclusions. And that has a bit of the history. It's just called one word, Catholicism by Richard McBrien. And we probably got it over in our library. You could go page through it to see if you like it. And if you did, you could get a hold of it. It'd be a great book to have in your library until I get mine published.
So, that'll be obsolete.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's right. Then you can throw it away. Yeah. Because the advantage of my book will be that it will be based on this outline, in a sense, which will always link the answers to the questions. Problem with a book like McBrien is you got a whole lot of answers, and you might not have any questions that go with it, which would be a problem.
I guess that's an important point, because I find that I tend to be embarrassed about my own tradition, of my own culture, just because when I ask my parents, they don't seem to have too many facts or reasons to explain. It's just like their parents have always done it that way, so and I don't go for that kind of a thing unless I have.
Interesting.
So I mean, I wish that there was some kind of a history written to that we can find a meaning in that.
Yeah. Anybody else want to pick up on that point?
Well, I just know we were reading Erasmus and Luther in a class this past winter quarter, and there's a lot of funny things you can do with the relics and those saints and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And people were asking, well, what do we do with the saints now, and where are we? And it was hard answering that.
Yeah.
I mean, I could give my own personal belief, but
you always need to link up with what our needs are and our experience. And one clear thing to me is the need for role models. And the only way that'll work is if you can say that people can be role models even though they didn't watch television or do other things like we do now. That is, that they exhibited a virtue that is universalizable, that you can take and say, yes, it's applicable to a larger scene. And I think that's very often the case. So we need role models. I'll tell you, one other link-up is that I believe in the solidarity of the human community, that we are all united in some ways that we can't understand. I can put it very personally and concretely. My father's dead 6 years. I was very close to my father, as many people know, and he's a very great influence on me. I believe there's a way in which I am still in communion with my father. I'm not embarrassed by saying that at all. I just think it makes perfect sense. Geography, I can be in communion with somebody who's 2,000 miles away. There's no reason at all why death has to break those bonds. I don't know how the flow goes. I have no idea, and I don't need to know, in a way. But I believe there's interaction. I believe my father is for me, just as he was as he walked this earth. I don't know why he would quit being for me. No? And therefore, that's an interesting way to think of the saints, as people who are for us. Good people who continue to exercise influence on the world.
That reminds me of something.
There's a flow. So there's two ideas I'm telling you: role model and solidarity of the human community. Go ahead.
It's well, fine with that important. I was just reading something by a guy named Viktor Frankl, existentialist, psychotherapist, and he was in a concentration camp, and he was saying his mother and his love for his mother got him through, and she was in a different concentration camp. And then one day he realized it didn't matter if she was alive or dead.
It was his wife, I think.
Or was it his, someone he loved.
But anyway,
It did not. That did
That's
not
right.
matter.
And he worked out a whole. That's right. And he worked out a whole therapy based on that. Yeah. That's a very important thing, bonding across distances. Yeah, that's very true. There's a lot to be said for that. Shall we go on? The third thing here that I tried to develop is the sacramental principle. And here, again, there is a difference between Catholicism and Protestantism in this way. I often kid around with this, but the dominant thing in the Protestant world is the Scripture. The pulpit in the church is the dominant piece of architecture, and the dominant thing in the service is the sermon. That's the Word. Protestantism is predominantly a religion of the Word. Catholicism is a religion of sacrament, of symbol. The predominant thing is at this worship service is communion. I used to preach in different churches in the New York area, and I would go up in the pulpit. Somebody would heard me say this. I'd go up in the pulpit, and when I went into a new church, I wouldn't say anything. I would just stand there. And very often, it would take a long time before the people would know that I wasn't saying anything. I have one particular vivid image of a guy sitting there in the front row with his wife, and after the gospel, he sits down and assumes his postures like this, and at about the 15-second mark of not saying anything, that's pretty long, he goes like this over towards his wife. And then at the 20-second mark, he's up like this, like, what's going on?